Yeah, Jeff, the last time that, to my recollection, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the last time that the left in the United States was violent was the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, back in the late
Tom,
60s, early 70s. Now we've got...
Tom, I'm coming to you from the studio in New York City, where our mayor in New York supported having a Puerto Rican Day Parade honor a terrorist.
A very curious exchange from a couple of evenings ago on RT America, which ironically stands for Russia Today. It's American Network. Stop and think about that for just a second. We allow the Russians to engage in commercial broadcasting on many cable systems in the United States with a special service to America. In much the same way there's BBC America, in much the same way there's CCTV, the Chinese television being shown in America. I digress a bit, but it just hit me, that point that we are so free, we allow our global adversaries to have, in essence, state-sponsored programming. And that was a public affairs program hosted by a proud liberal, Thom Hartmann, who I find to be a very pleasant guy. I've known him for years. We have had a pleasant relationship socially, conversationally, but he was making a point. Well, let's call up an article from the Daily Caller. Betsy Rothstein, who I used to know back in the day when she covered Capitol Hill and the House for The Hill and interviewed me several times. You see the headline, Thom Hartmann, in regards to his remarks, his timing could not have been worse. But quite frankly, Tom's memory was a bit faulty. You heard one of the guests, Jeff Stier, correct him in terms of the curiosity of a parade in New York where a Puerto Rican terrorist was being honored just over the weekend. Jeff Stier, a senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research, in charge of risk analysis for that fine group, joins us this morning from Newsmax, New York. Jeff, I would imagine that we always say hindsight is 20/20, but you were trying to point out to Thom Hartmann that all is not peaceful on the left, and that you can't look back at, I guess some on the left would call it a bit of nostalgia, perhaps tinged with regret for the bombings and the activities of the Weathermen back in the 1970s, but the left has not been, quote, violence-free in the intervening years, has it?
Well, that's exactly right. And he did say, correct me if I'm wrong, so I took the liberty to do so. But a little bit of context. This interview was on Tuesday night. I am a free market think tank health policy expert, so I was on to talk about health care and the health care bill. And Thom Hartmann does a few topics in one sitting. So he went on to do this thing about how there were two Democratic candidates for office who dropped out of their races. Perhaps they weren't going to win anyway. And they blamed threats of violence by the right for the reason they dropped out. And my response was, I think, pretty straightforward, which is there is absolutely no excuse for threats from the right or violence from the right. And equally, there's no excuse for threats or violence from the left, and both sides on the extremes are guilty of it. That's why I think we ought to spend more time talking about policy rather than all of the other stuff. And that's what blew my mind. This was Tuesday evening, the night before yesterday. And he said, oh, that's not true. It's just the right. There hasn't been violence on the right since the Weathermen in the 60s and 70s. And that blew my mind. And I did push back. But it was just such a shocking thing to hear from him, even Tuesday night. But the reason the left does this, and they like to blame any violence or threats of violence from the extreme right on the right, is because I believe they're not going to be able to win the policy arguments on the merits. So they say, oh, well, there are far-right extremists who are sometimes occasionally responsible for threats or violence, and that should be reflected on the policies that those of us that are libertarians or on the right promote. So they attack us for other people's activity and say, oh, well, you guys should lose because there are these attacks. And I simply said there's no room for the attacks. The left does it too, but I don't attack the left because there are crazy people or extremists on the left that do these things. I thought we were going to move, have a discussion and move forward from there. And he said, no, the left doesn't do violence. That was Tuesday night. Well, sadly, I woke up Wednesday morning to this horrible news, and it blew my mind. I thought nobody was really. It's Russian television. I hope that too many people weren't here watching. But I did want to call them out on it because I think this is a political tactic that they use to politicize these issues, and how embarrassing it must be for Thom Hartmann, how embarrassing it must be for the Putin TV channel to have done this and said this Tuesday night.
Well, as you point this out, and as I'm listening to you talk about the power of ideas, I'm thinking of a couple of things, and that is how all too often in our public discourse, certainly in campaigns, it's not the power of ideas, it's real and or imagined personal failings that come front and center. Perhaps it was ever thus, but I'm not here to argue that today, Jeff. What I am, the point that I think needs to be made as one who has been in the trenches, there has only now, I think, is the right really understanding that for the last 4 decades, while Ronald Reagan was rebuilding our national defense and winning the Cold War, we failed to notice what was happening here at home, not in terms of the power of ideas, but the power of indoctrination and the power of pop culture and the power of enshrining a double standard. And so you get a situation, and I remember this from my campaigns, if someone on the left said something unpopular, within 24 hours, the next story, the next narrative would be, oh, now my life is being threatened. Forgive me.
Yeah.
But as one who's
because
been
they don't want to talk about the issues.
And maybe you've been they don't want to talk. And on top of that, the other tactic that is utilized in town hall meetings, and certainly they have gotten much more aggressive, where there is not even dialogue, there's just shouting down the member of Congress or the U.S. Senator standing before them. But it used to be there was a script that was followed. And someone from the left would come in, and the narrative would begin thusly: Congressman, I've been a Republican my entire life. And I have been a proud Republican voter, but you have spoiled it for me. Well, look, we came to understand those are just part of the tactics of disinformation. And the other tactic that they have chosen to go to is what rhetoricians call linkage. Whenever something horrible happens, the left is willing to link it to everybody on the right, except maybe now people are more sophisticated to it, but certainly we saw it in the shooting of Gabby Giffords, when the left decided that Sarah Palin was to blame for a nut in Tucson showing up at Congress on the corner. The sad thing is, Jeff, tactics have overtaken real debate, and you are wise to point it out. So I guess the obvious question, Jeff, how do we get it back on track? How do we return to profound policy arguments in public discourse?
Well, I think we have to. I'll give you an example, JD, because you asked that question. Yesterday, I had a piece published in National Review Online on why the U.S. should cut off funding for the World Health Organization until it gets its act together. I think it was a substantive policy piece based on news events that happened with the WHO, scandals that even the AP reported, that the WHO spends more on travel than it does on some of the worst diseases like AIDS and tuberculosis and Ebola combined. They're just traveling around the world. And they just elected a radical from Ethiopia, part of the Marxist regime in Ethiopia. They elected him now to head the WHO. So as the president's budget comes out, as Congress considers the budget, I took all that information and did a policy piece on why, if public health is important to you, global public health, pandemics is important, then we owe it to the world as the biggest funder of the WHO to cut off that funding until they clean up their act. So I keep writing those policy pieces, but the day it came out yesterday, all the interest in the media was on the unfortunate incident that took place. That happens. But I think we have to stick to making policy arguments and not get sidetracked by all of this noise And we ought not to be guilty of it of ourselves. I don't think we should be blaming the left for what happened yesterday. We don't know all the facts yet. I do think we should call them on it when they say the left isn't involved in this, when they're at the same time, as happened on the Thom Hartmann show Tuesday night, blaming the right, policy people on the right, for radical acts. I think all of that should be, I think there'll be less of the radical acts if we stick to policy discussions. I think both sides are guilty of it. When people go on the air, they go on MSNBC and they rile people up, yeah, they ought to have a recognition that there are people out there who will be riled up and act inappropriately by that. I don't think that's the fault of CNN and MSNBC for riling up this guy if they did. But I think they ought to keep that in mind, and I think the right ought to do the same, and we ought to have policy discussions. Right now, it's just all news bites, all fake news, and it doesn't serve us as a country well.
Well, perhaps what we need to do, and you certainly have couched it in these terms with your piece on the World Health Organization, you're pointing out the necessity of sound public policy, but you're also pointing out the outrages. And dare I say that part of the challenge is to introduce these public policy arguments in ways that are understood, as you just did, very cogently pointing out the absurdity of having someone from Ethiopia now running the World Health Organization. It reminds me when we tried to pull some funding. You go ahead, sir.
From the Ethiopian Marxist regime. Not a health guy from Ethiopia. That's one thing. This guy was the foreign minister of Ethiopia. He was part of the repressive Marxist regime that's now running Ethiopia under a state of emergency for an extended period of time. So, but yeah, your point is well taken, is that we have to make the policy arguments. We have to make them newsworthy. We have to have good news hooks. We have to present them in easy to understand, clear ways. So, excuse me, even a congressman could understand them. And make our case and make it in an interesting way.
Well, Jeff, again, I'm a recovering member of Congress, but I do recall a similar situation where with, I guess it had to do with human rights. The UN was going to put a member of Gaddafi's regime in Libya in charge back a decade and a half ago, and so we worked to try and strip that funding. Just one little side note.
And we didn't learn our lesson.
If you ever have a chance to... Yeah, we never seem to learn our lesson. But there is one rhetorical device that smart guys like you, I don't know if you own up to it now, but as a congressman, when I would have a briefing from someone from a think tank, the code words for listen very carefully on this, the preamble would be, Congressman, as you well know, and that was the code word for, you probably don't have a clue about this, but you need to listen to what we're saying. So there are rhetorical niceties. Now back to another salient point you're making, Jeff, and that is there have been abuses by lone actors on both the left and the right. Yesterday on MSNBC, Chuck Todd shows up. I want to listen to what it is he had to say, and then you and I'm not sure we're going to completely agree, but let's listen to what Chuck Todd said yesterday on MSNBC.
Folks, some will want to blame the left or the right or us in the media. But here's who it seems too many folk don't want to blame: themselves. We are all to blame. This toxic stew that passes for political discourse seems beyond repair in the current moment. Just look at social media. For too long, our collective politics has demonized the other side for caustic behavior, while rationalizing that same behavior when it comes from someone who shares their politics.
Well, it's very well written, very articulate, but it amounts to a pox on both your houses, and shame on you, news consumer. There is collective guilt for anyone who happens to be watching. I'm sorry, I think that's too broad a casting of blame. Agree or disagree with Chuck Todd on what he had to say, Jeff?
I agree with a lot of what he had to say, except for the fact that he said it yesterday to say, oh, well, everyone's to blame, without saying MSNBC may for riling everyone up, like this crazy person, if that's what he was. He didn't take responsibility for MSNBC taking it. He said, pox on all of our houses. I think if Chuck Todd should watch the big picture with Thom Hartmann that I was on the night before, when, when Thom Hartmann was blaming the right, only the right.
Yeah, and you know, the irony of that, when we talk about the power of words, as you just mentioned this, Jeff, the big picture, well, I know there's no copyright, but remember back in the day, in the 50s and 60s, the big picture was the name of the weekly television series produced by the United States Army. So go figure, the power of words and recasting them in the way they do. But speaking of a big picture and giving us challenges to think about, Jeff Stier, this morning from Newsmax, New York. Sir, you have our thanks. We'll have you back again real soon. Back with